Hey folks, Grant here. So we've got something a little bit different for you today. As you know, when the Bens and I get together, our conversations have a tendency to steer towards education. And when we do that, it's very common for the conversation to sort of be up in the clouds without always acknowledging what the realities on the ground actually look like for, real teachers and real schools and the real problems that they face. Stenhaug, having done Teach for America, is still connected with a good number of people who are in just such positions, some of them with pretty interesting vantage points. So what we wanted to do here was bring on one of them, Jason Fullen, who is a vice principal, but he also spends a lot of time in a math classroom itself. As a result, the tone is pretty different from our usual conversations, much more centered on his experience where the rubber meets the road of education, but I think it's in a really good way. And I should mention up front that the audio quality with the call with Jason was not optimal, so sorry about that, but the actual content of what he has to say really is worth it. So let me just turn things over to the conversation.
Okay, welcome to the podcast. This is Ben, and Blue, and we're going to welcome Jason Fullen to the podcast. We're excited today because Jason's on the podcast. Jason and I taught together in Teach for America. Since then, Jason has moved back to Columbus, Ohio, and is now serving as an AP at a middle school, and he's in charge of mathematics content. Jason, why don't you just give us a little background on the program that you're in, kind of your path, I guess, to and from Teach for America into the position you're in right now?
Sure. So I am part of a program called Bright Ohio. It is an educational leadership program that has just started within the last few years to try and recruit and retain high-quality leaders from all backgrounds and walks of life to serve as principals in high-poverty schools in Ohio.
I think Jason is facing realities and understands realities on the ground that maybe we haven't hit on this podcast, and us three have these like starry-eyed idealistic visions of how math should be taught and how schools should approach math. And I think if in this podcast we can somehow like move to the middle and find a bridge between the realities on the ground and our starry-eyed vision for K-12 would be really, really cool. So maybe, Jason, why don't you tell us about the specific school you're an AP at and then what the math looks like maybe a little bit in particular, because I understand you're in charge of thinking about math and boosting math scores, right?
Sure, definitely. So as a part of the program that I'm in, understanding that principals do need to be instructional leaders, and it's important that principals understand what it is to be a teacher and understand standards and how to, teach and manage a classroom and then be able to support and develop teachers in their efforts to do that. So as a result of that focus, I actually spend one period a day co-teaching with a sixth grade math teacher in my building just as part of my regular schedule. So I am in a sixth grade math building in our school every single day. And then as a result of that, I've been tasked with really thinking about sixth grade math more broadly throughout the entire school, and then just sixth through eighth grade math even broader than that, and thinking about how we can improve performance and ensure that our students are getting what they need to be successful, not just on our state tests, but also as growing mathematicians as they go, higher and higher into their academic career. So a little bit about our school. Like I said, 6th through 8th grades, we have about just under 1,000 students. So each grade is anywhere between 250 to 350 students. We're about 55% white, non-Hispanic, so about 45%, minority students. We have about 12% of students that are limited English proficiency or, English as a second language. And then about 45% of all of our school is considered economically disadvantaged, or meaning that, they qualify for free and reduced lunch. So just a quick rundown again, 1,000 kids, 55% white, 45% minority, 45% economically disadvantaged, and then about a 10 to 12% of students are limited English speakers. In the district, we utilize a couple different programs. First, for all our math curriculum, it's called CPM, or College Preparatory Mathematics. So it is supposed to be a college prep math curriculum. And what that looks like, and we'll, I'm sure, talk about this more, is it's just very concept-based, very team discussion oriented. Very rarely are we doing worksheets or rote multiplication tables or any just kind of typical computational problems. They're much more real-world context, group discussion, and then a lot of the teacher role is to give a lot of pushback, to ask for clarification, even when a student gets a question wrong, tell us, how do you know it's wrong? And really just kind of pushing them to really think as opposed to just trying to kind of come up with the answer.
If I can ask a question just on the group discussion side, I think the spirit of that is obviously great. The learning will come when someone really has to articulate a point and defend it, even if that is in the case of math. Now, the loose impression that I get if I just hear, oh, we will have a group discussion-oriented math lesson, is you might have some kind of open-ended problem, and you put it in front of the students, and maybe most of them understand, maybe some of them don't quite grok it. But when you say get into groups of 4 and discuss, or like we as a classroom are going to discuss this problem, you kind of end up with a handful of people who are somewhat into it, answering all of the questions and providing all the ideas, and then some maybe kind of sitting back and trying to avoid being called upon or providing that much. What do you actually do to avoid that dynamic? And I think you see this in adults also. Whenever you try to bring about some kind of discussion, it's very hard to get everybody actually contributing new information to the discussion at hand. So what does that look like, from your eyes?
Sure. We definitely see that issue, and so this is then when you start to get into, well, how are we grouping students? So in our particular class, we have kind of specifically grouped 4 of our students who are high performing and significantly outperforming the rest of the students together as a means of trying to differentiate and allowing them to really kind of take things to the next level as they're able to talk with one another. They are typically on task because, they're very rules oriented and want to appease the teacher and want to make sure that they're doing the right thing. Whereas many of our other students who we've specifically kind of taken some of the I don't want to say natural, but some of the leaders out of the classroom and kind of allowed the students to have to figure it out on their own, so to speak. And a lot of it looks like, from an accountability standpoint, myself and the lead teacher going around. I'll go to a table and say, all right, what do we think? And then, in a smaller setting as opposed to in front of the entire class, okay, I hear their thinking, I hear what they're talking about, and then trying to provide some immediate feedback or immediate, hey, why don't you think about this a little bit more as opposed to that, or why this versus that, and then go on to the next table. And we do a quick little rounds, and then we call everybody back together and then have one or a couple groups share out. At that point, hopefully we have at least heard a little bit from each group, and we know that for the most part, students were talking on task and were attempting to kind of complete whatever the task was. How in depth or well that happens, once I leave their table and go to the next table is hard to manage.
When you, if you go to one of those tables and it's got 4 students, and let's say there's one that you notice as being particularly quiet, if it was me, it would feel really awkward to try to single him or her out in particular, because on the one hand, they're the ones that you want to contribute more, so you might target a question. But if they're the one who feels a little less confident with the material and is, shaking in their boots about being called upon and letting that be exposed, you run the risk of offering them a traumatic experience, or traumatic might be kind of an exaggeration, but how do you balance
but uncomfortable
that? Yeah, right.
Yeah.
You don't want to provide discomfort to the ones who are not following. They're the ones that you want to put the most at ease.
Of course. And so I will say that a lot of that has to do with the culture building of the class in and of itself. And I will say I'm very happy that I got placed with this particular teacher, because I've been very impressed by her diligent and intentional effort to create a classroom culture that is conducive to just that, to being okay and safe to make mistakes. So we actually just today in our class, every Monday is called Mindset Monday. And we start the class with a discussion, a book, a short video, something to do with kind of growth mindset, and how the reality is that mistakes in the context of math class are actually really helpful. And they are actually, great signs of evidence to help lead us to the right answer. So we actually read a book today that was about a student who never made a mistake, and then it goes on through this, big story. And then at the very end, she makes a mistake and life goes on. And then she finally kind of, is no longer known as the girl who doesn't make mistakes, but she's known as the girl who is just like everybody else. So kind of using that as almost a little bit of an example to kind of help students just feel more comfortable being able to offer an answer that they may not be 100% sure is right, and that it's okay to get something wrong, and that you're really being cognizant of any social ridicule that may happen and quickly kind of nipping that in the bud as a form of class culture. That is something that we've really tried to emphasize to hopefully create that safe space so that students can take risks and that that's okay.
Do you see that sort of growth mindset extending beyond the classroom? So, I mean, you talk about making sure that in that classroom, there's a culture of being able to go out on a limb and things like that. But then do you see people internalizing that and then taking that to other classes, or is that hard to evaluate?
That's a great question. I'd say from a surface level, no. I think that at this point, and again, so this particular class, they're sixth graders. This is their first entry, first year at the building. So we're talking, we're 3 months into the school year, and I don't know what sort of prior knowledge they had with growth mindset before coming to our school. I see many of our students know what growth mindset is and can recall to you very easily, kind of what that means, or give you an example of where one might show that, and also tell you why is it important. But then, go on to take their test, and then we give them an opportunity for test corrections, and then nobody does test corrections. So in practice, I don't always see that, and I don't know how much of that is just hey, these are 11 and 12-year-olds who are developing and growing and maturing, or if that is if we're really not teaching the growth mindset as in depth or as maybe competently as we need to be. But unfortunately, I don't see a lot of carryover from one class to the other because I think that, this teacher has really made an intentional effort to focus on that. I don't see as much of an intentional effort for that same thing by other staff members.
Yeah, that's what I wonder, if there's maybe a curricular thing that could be done. Because obviously there's a huge difference between being able to explain what a growth mindset is and actually changing your attitudes and adopting that as part of who you are.
Of course. And we have a somewhat of like a homeroom kind of type period, or it's called seminar. So it's very much like a 20-minute period where students go to right before lunch. And that's been a time that oftentimes kind of just becomes like a glorified study hall for students just to work on some homework or, get this organized or that organized, where we're really missing an opportunity that could be just that. That could be the 20-minute lesson on growth mindset or on resilience or grit or whatever the social emotional thing for the week is. And that one ensures that all 1,000 students are hearing this similar message. And then that also allows teachers to then be able to speak in that same common language across class to class, and students know what they're talking about and they can apply that same concept in all their classes, and not just math or not just the particular content area where I'm learning it.
This is interesting because one of the things that we have talked about before is kind of the advantage of active learning versus passively sitting and like hearing a teacher lecture to you, let's say about math.
Sure.
Like if you really want to internalize math, then you've got to be doing something playing with it. And I wonder, insofar as we want to teach a growth mindset, if it's easy to fall into the same traps where the instinct for how to teach it is to lecture it to them or to tell it to them, to, read the story about it. I'm trying to think right now, what is the equivalent of active learning, of discussing the math problem, but in the context of growth mindset, where it's not just about knowing what it is, but somehow flexing that muscle? Is it like maybe it's an incentive structure around, not just rewarding people and choosing to retake their tests, for like the example you chose there,
Sure.
In terms of a higher test score, but with some other acclamation.
I like that idea of integrating it throughout the day and having all of the teachers speaking a common language, because I think that does give you the tool or the lever for it to be more active, right? Because you can have teachers giving directed feedback. Students are going to be in situations where growth mindset might help them, and they might not think to take some particular action. They may not stick with something, or they may not stick their head out and suggest a potentially wrong answer. And that's where a teacher could give very targeted feedback. Or a student might actually take that risk, and the teacher could also give feedback. And having that common language and having everyone on the same page and having all the teachers giving, similar feedback to students in situations that are appropriate for each student might be that active learning way, which is when it's appropriate to give feedback to an individual because they are engaging in activity or behavior where a growth mindset might either help them or is helping them.
Most definitely. I mean, I would think that teachers and staff members are likely the ones who would have to help to be able to really call out kind of that behavior, whether it's growth or fixed in that moment, to help that student identify, okay, in practice, what you're doing right now is an example of a growth mindset. And then maybe there is some incentive or some, I think in our class, whenever a student figures out that our teacher made a mistake, they get a little raffle ticket, and then we have a raffle at the end of the week, or something like that for a piece of candy. But something to be able to call out those moments. And then I think for students, especially at this developmental age, the reflection piece is huge. They may not understand in that moment, hey, I'm showing a growth or a fixed mindset. But a few days later, when prompted, hey, think back, what was something that was hard, but you persevered in this week or yesterday, or, what was something that was really difficult and you felt yourself shut down. Being able to reflect and providing that kind of reflective opportunity, I think, is one of the best ways to really help kind of push students towards more cognizance of knowing, okay, now I am in a fixed mindset, or I am right now in a growth mindset, because we just know with adolescents, it can be very hard for them to know in that moment, this is what I'm doing, to have that self-awareness.
Yeah, you need to know in the moment what you're doing. And then I think, yeah, you're absolutely right with the reflection. You've got to be able to connect your behavior, whether it's growth or fixed, to an outcome, whether it's successful or not.
What I wonder sometimes about growth mindset, and we can have a 24-hour special on growth mindset, but is you talk about creating a classroom culture that fosters growth mindset and where students are free to fail and everything. And then, so it seems like we're trying to get students to feel free in that exact environment they're in. But then also we're trying to create a growth mindset that's kind of deeper in their soul that they're going to take to other places. And I kind of liken it too. I want to get better at public speaking. So I did Toastmasters, and I got really good at speaking in this church basement to the 9 members of Toastmasters. And then the next time I went to do a public speech to someone else in a higher stakes context, I was just as nervous as before. And it was like I created this in context confidence that didn't carry over. And so I wonder about that with growth mindset sometimes.
I bet it would carry over there. I mean, maybe you were nervous that first time, but I bet if you continued to do public speaking in that sort of higher stakes context, I bet you'd adapt much quicker than you would if you hadn't had the other experience.
Yeah, it's certainly not zero progress, but you have some sort of little reset when you switch context. I think that's true. I want to step back. So Jason, just to underline something, I'm sure low key you're an elite math mind, but like I know you passed 6th grade math. I assume I wasn't in your classroom, and with your golf game, you've got to count pretty high. So I know you must be decent at math. But during Teach for America,
I did just squeak by 6th grade math.
But during Teach for America, you were a social studies teacher, and you majored in music. And your interests, if I was going to rank them from, I don't know, most to least interested, math wouldn't come up for a while. You kind of have a fresh slate then for looking at math education in this context that you're thrown into. I'm curious, as compared to other educational contexts like your social studies classroom or other curriculums you've thought about, what surprised you and what's different about math?
My only real context for math education prior to this class was the 13 years that I spent in a math class, and then you add in, a couple calculus rounds in college, and then a couple stats courses in grad school, just the only classes that I have taken as a student. So like you said, Ben, never taught, never really had any interest to teach, but I always kind of liked math. I'm a pretty like type A. I like kind of, things being very, very clear. There's one answer, et cetera, et cetera. Very easy to figure out. How this has been different, I have been most surprised by how, just kind of like what I said earlier, how discussion oriented and how the teacher serves way more as a facilitator than they do as a director, if you will, or as someone who is saying, nope, hey, the way you do this problem is, you carry the one, you do that, and then you've got your answer. It's been much more of a, well, how did you do the answer? Okay, how did you do the answer? And in my discussions and research, I kind of got that math education, to my understanding, has shifted a little bit with kind of some of the dawn of Common Core and trying to go a little bit deeper as opposed to wider. And I have been just intrigued by that. I think that especially in education, everyone has a little bit of personal bias. So, I kind of feel like, hey, the way I learn math worked for me pretty well. Like, I know all my multiplication tables up through 12. Like, these kids probably should too. And I've seen a lot of differences between, we take this much more discussion-oriented approach, and then we get down and get ready to solve a problem. And I'm asking a kid, okay, so what's 8 times 4? And they're thinking, and then, you start to see them count on their fingers. And I'm thinking in my mind, whoa, this should be like a immediate thing. But as I talk with my lead teacher and kind of go through it, that I see that there's been a little bit of this push away from, again, like the computational, like you just don't need to know, or it's not as important to know just these like flashcard multiplication numbers, because in most real world contexts, you'll have a calculator or some other device. But though that has been kind of the biggest stark difference from just my own experiences in math ed. And then it's been much more, as a result, been much more facilitative and discussion oriented than I would have guessed coming out of, say, a social studies classroom as a teacher.
And these are students that are a grade level or 2 behind on average, or where are your students performing currently?
I've got students who are in our class anywhere from the 10th to the 90th percentile for their relative, for 6th grade, for where they are right now. So a lot, that looks like a grade level equivalency from anywhere from 3rd to 9th grade, all within one 6th grade classroom.
That's got to be difficult. You reference how there seems to be a lower emphasis on computation. On the one hand, that feels very inspiring just because, all the reasons I like math, I have nothing to do with arithmetic, but all of the open-ended things.
Sure.
I wonder if there is a risk, though, that you accidentally end up with students coming out lacking certain proficiencies. Like, it's not so much that we want them to be able to compute 8 times 4 immediately off the top of their head,
right,
but something about that feels like an indicator for whether or not they have built a little bit of a relationship with numbers before.
No, I want them to be able to compute it. That's not even an indicator. I need them to know the times table. I want to know 8 by 4.
Well, I'll say this, but what seems positive is the fact that that's not this super emphasized, this is what math is about thing, and that maybe their relationship with math is centered on something else. But it does, it strikes me as almost a red flag that if that's not an ancillary benefit that they get from whatever the other core relationship, whatever the discussion-oriented target is, do you think there might be something lacking in this new format, the difference between what you see today versus what you remember from your own background?
So I have an interesting perspective here because I never really truly learned my math facts. So I'm a little bit rusty when it comes to multiplication. And that absolutely hurt me in math. As I've talked about before, I kind of hit a wall at some point because I just couldn't keep up, and that hurt me. And it wasn't until sort of later in life that I had more time to kind of go through and learn things and fill in my gaps and kind of catch up. But even so, I still am pretty rusty when it comes to math facts, and I'm always reaching for a calculator. And on the one hand, I turned out all right. And I feel like I've got a pretty good relationship with math. And, in terms of being able to reason abstractly and construct arguments and model things with mathematics, the sort of Common Core standards for mathematical practice and things, I think I'm doing pretty well. But there's also a part of me that, there are times in life where it's just kind of inconvenient that I can't compute things in my head. So I can see both sides.
And this has kind of been one of the main kind of rubs for me to think about. We have 56 minutes, with our students every single day. And that is, the only time that, and for the most part, that they're going to have math, in that day. And when you think about, again, where students are coming in, below, on grade level, above grade level, and thinking about some of those gaps and, the computational needs of then being able to kind of continue to move up in the curriculum, how we should spend our time, how we should allot those 56 minutes. Because I would agree, I don't want my students to just leave this class, to leave this year and just be awesome at being able to recite their times tables, but not be able to solve a real world context problem. But at the same time, I see those the subtraction, the addition, those times tables, etc., as a very necessary skill to be able to do a lot of those problems and do a lot of those problems in a quick and confident way that continues to pull them in to want to do more math. I see so many students who are trying to figure out this really engaging problem, and they get to, I need to know, 5 times 6 to find a common denominator. And then they kind of sit there for a second, and then, and maybe it's a matter of them not having a calculator right there available for them, but then kind of getting sidetracked because they just hit this obstacle and they're not showing a great growth mindset, or they're not persevering very much, and then they kind of start to shrink back a little bit. And I wonder how that could reinforce itself over and over and over again, and then really start to just diminish the love or the interest in math, as opposed to those computational things just being a gateway for making everything else to come a little bit easier.
So this is an interesting question that gets at something we've talked about a lot before, which is mastery learning. Is you've got kids that are, in terms of grade level, you said 3rd through 9th grade, all in this one 6th grade class. And so, what is the right thing to do there? Is the right thing to do to get all of these kids to do as well as they can on the 6th grade standards? Or is the right thing to do to say, well, okay, if you're at 3rd grade level, you're going to work on 3rd grade standards. And one of those 3rd grade Common Core standards is to know from memory math facts, multiplication tables through 10. And that's what you're going to work on because that's the level you're at. And if you're at 9th grade, then you're going to work on the 9th grade standards or the high school standards. Or is it to say, no, everyone's in 6th grade, we're going to see how well we can get you to do these 6th grade standards?
From a practical sense, one, this is where you get a lot of teachers, and understandably so, being very frustrated. Frustrated that as a 6th grade math teacher, at the end of the year, they're going to be held responsible for the students' performance on the 6th grade math, state test. And there's not a whole lot of time to go back and teach 3rd, 4th, or 5th grade, or 5th grade standards. And now this is just the reality of education and of differentiation. I mean, all subjects, have this same issue, and it's all a matter of, well, how do we differentiate? How do we give multiple points of access, or entry for students on different levels? And this is where we start to think about our math program at a high level as to what are we doing to address this. So we have something in our school called Math Lab. And this is if you think about just kind of, our various intervention models, this is like at the top, tier 3, top of the pyramid for about, 5 to 10% of our students, 6 through 8, enroll in Math Lab, where it's they have one period every other day where they will go and they work on ALEKS, which is our the individualized kind of instruction program that we have utilized, or that the district has a contract with, and they do that work for the entire period. And then, so it's meeting them where they're at. It's really interesting about kind of like the understanding the knowledge that and the knowledge that you're ready to learn. And it, has its algorithm, et cetera, and students work through that.
And so in that case, if you're at a 3rd grade level, you're going to get 3rd grade content. If you're at an 8th grade level, you're going to get 8th grade content. Okay. Exactly.
And you move up and hopefully for our, that 10% that is in, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, that is helping remediate a lot of those basic lower level gaps. Now, for the other 90%, but again, if we're just taking our bottom 50 to 100 students, we still have a lot of other students who are not where they need to be and having difficulty accessing the grade level content. So all students have access to this ALEKS program, and we have, as a school and as a department, have just been struggling to figure out how do we integrate that into everything else we do? Again, for a 56-minute period, and we're going through our normal standards and normal pacing, when are students having the time to get on ALEKS and to do those lessons. And that is where we're at a constant kind of tension, because those students who are in math lab, I mean, they have at least a couple, 2 to 3 days a week where they're having that concentrated time. But everybody else, I mean, you could go a couple weeks and not have time to be on it just by virtue of what you're planning and what you're teaching as a teacher.
And the big constraint there is the evaluation, the fact that teachers are being evaluated for the how the students do on the material that is at their grade level, whether the student is actually ready for it or not.
And now, a lot of in Ohio for students, or I'm sorry, for teachers and their evaluation, it is a growth measure. So again, if you have a student who comes in at a third grade level, well, provided by the end of the year they've grown, at least a year, or some calculation of that, it's not negatively hurting you. But again, if my student is on a third or fourth grade level, I'm teaching them sixth grade math. I'm not teaching them fourth grade math. And I don't know the standards well enough to really know how much those things may be aligned or disaligned. So again, if I'm expecting my sixth grade teacher to, just by virtue of having the student in your room and being around math for a year, I should expect them to go from fourth to fifth grade. I don't know if that's a reasonable expectation given what's being introduced and taught in sixth grade versus what they need to be learning in fourth grade.
That's a great point. So from an accountability standpoint, this is a huge problem in assessment. We talk about growth measures and we talk about if you get some students that are on a second or a third grade level, if you can improve them by 2 grade levels to maybe fourth or fifth, you're going to be seen as effective and just as effective as someone that started with 6th grade level students and had them advance through 6th grade standards. However, that doesn't take into account the fact that the test, the assessment they're going to take at the end of the year is terribly constructed to assess a student's 3rd or 4th grade ability. So now the variance on that score is much higher. You have a very little sense. You're taking a 6th grade test and trying to decide if they're on a 3rd, 4th, or a 5th grade level. And that instrument's not very effective at that.
Well, is that true? Or are you using something like the MAP test that is a cross-grade test?
So this is kind of where things get a little complicated. So we have the Ohio State test, which is the end of year kind of assessment that affects our proficiency scores and grade as a school, that affects the teacher's evaluation. And that is a grade level, that is the 6th grade content test, or 7th grade or 8th grade or whatever it is. And you either are proficient, advanced, or accelerated, or you are limited or basic. So those 2 being below proficiency and the other 3 being above.
And that's the test that the school's held accountable for. And if there was merit-based pay, the teacher would be rewarded for, right? That is the marquee test, correct or no?
Correct. Now, we don't have merit-based pay, but yes, that is the test. Now, our district also uses something similar to MAP, which is called STAR, which is developed by Renaissance, which I believe is close to, it's a McGraw-Hill subsidiary or something. And that is something just for our district data and school data. That is a adaptive test that will show student growth regardless of where they start. And then that gives us some interesting data to see how students are growing across the year. But again, for the state, they never see that data. And that it has nothing to do with kind of what the proficiency scores are at the end of the year.
Is there an argument for using that grade level targeted test as what the state's looking at, or really to use it at all versus an adaptive test? Or is it just a question of sort of policies and things just not catching up to what everyone kind of agrees are best practices? Not to put you on the spot there.
That's a great question. I mean, I would say yes. I mean, yeah, if I think that if we're talking about understanding that many students are not going to be proficient and still needing to understand the growth that they're making, or still encouraging teachers to help support that growth. Now, I believe the state has a very kind of complicated, robust algorithm that is supposed to give each student kind of a goal based on prior year proficiency testing. And now, again, meaning that if a student is not proficient a year prior, like they have a growth goal that the teacher can still be kind of credited for that student making the necessary growth without them being quote unquote proficient. I just think, again, the challenge is what we said earlier with the expectation for the teacher. What are they teaching in their classroom? Well, they are teaching 6th grade math. And depending on, again, the alignment or misalignment between prior year standards and the current year standards, even if we are using STAR or MAP or some other adaptive test, I still don't know, like, is the teacher taking the time to reteach the 4th grade standards to help that student grow to 5th grade while she still needs to be moving on with the current year standards? And so that's where in practice, we're always trying to spiral in, old concepts, old material, review, whether it's in a quick warm up for the class or an exit ticket or something, just to always be keeping those things fresh. And hopefully we're building on them by virtue of the math content we're working on.
That's madness, though. That's madness.
Yeah, exactly. Stenok, that seems like madness, and it seems difficult to even think about how you'd handle that as a teacher. So my dumb question is, why, if you have a student at a 4th grade level, do you not just put them in a 4th grade math class?
So we do have in Ohio, we have something called the 3rd grade reading guarantee. So that means that students in the 3rd grade take a test, and if they don't pass it, they don't get fully promoted. Now, my understanding in some elementary schools is you would actually have a 4th grader who may go back down to 3rd grade for their reading class so long as they haven't passed that test. Now, so again, it's kind of the matriculation, like they're not technically a 4th grader, but maybe they have moved on, but they're still trying to take the 3rd grade test. And I think just practically, again, if we have a 6th grade student, I don't know how would they take 4th grade, or are you presuming that they should never have made it on, they should not have moved on to 6th grade in the first place if they are, struggling to get 3rd or 4th grade content. And that's where, at the middle school level, we're right smack dab in the middle where we inherit a lot of issues, if you will. If something hasn't been working for 6 years, well, now, we're just seeing that it's wasn't working for 6 years, and now we're trying to figure out what to do. And we have an every other day math lab intervention that'll hopefully make up some of that. But it is my understanding that we could very well have kids who spend 3 years in math lab and will move on to high school and probably move on to a similar type program in high school where they're just always trying to catch up.
Is it as simple as just a logistic issue that at the middle school, you only have the math teacher for 6th grade math? You can't get that student over to some different classroom purely for a math class and then bring them back to the middle school building. Math, that actually seems, it seems pretty good. It's a lot better than, nothing, or kind of hoping that they would learn by osmosis, just being among some mathy thing happening, even if it's above their level. But
for sure.
Would it work for everyone to do something like Math Lab? So effectively, everyone is using some sort of computer adaptive system that is giving them content that's appropriate for them. And there are teachers available to sort of help one-on-one as folks get stuck to kind of help everyone along. But everyone is doing that. A, is that practical? And B, if it is the reason that we're not doing that, come down to that sort of assessment, the fact that, the assessment at the end is 6th grade.
I think that that's a great idea. I think that the reality is that 54 minutes out of a 7-hour day for math is probably not enough. Now you start to get into kind of the murky waters of what should a school day look like? How diverse should it be? How much, what is a necessary amount of time for students to actually be able to pique their interest, to be able to learn in a substantive way, but also not rob them of being in a class for so long that you're taking away other multi-curricular opportunities. So, for instance, prior to being in this school, I worked at a high-performing charter school, and our students had, in addition to being on an extended day, so they went to school for about an hour and a half longer than their public school counterparts, they had math for close to 2.5 hours during that day. and you had about a 2 to 2.5 hours of reading. And then you had an hour of science or an hour of social studies, throw in gym and lunch, and then, you're done for the day. So it was, some might argue that it was much more constrained in a like curricular diversity, but also allowed us to really dig in deep. And I mean, oftentimes our growth scores for the state tests were off the charts because we got students who came in very behind, but I mean, we devoted an hour a day to Khan Academy. I mean, we just had kids on Khan Academy. They had to, they had some accountability kind of tracker or some, worksheet that they were supposed to fill out to show what they were working on. And they did that every hour to start the day. I mean, that was just, a really positive time for them just to be able to kind of scaffold in and spiral in some of those gaps. So yes, I think that like a math lab for everybody would be awesome. I think the logistical nature of our, we have 7 periods in the day, take out one for lunch. And then, you've got your science, social studies, math, and language arts. And then, students have a couple extracurricular options, and the space fills up pretty quickly.
So more from a bird's eye view, you have 2 tests at least that you've talked about. You've talked about a goal of having discussions and having students interact and maybe create a joy for math. As an AP and more of a school leader, are there specific goals for math? Do you guys have a goal to reach some percentile on the finalized state assessment, some other goal to have a growth mindset, maybe measurable, maybe not? But what are the math goals for the school?
As a district, our goal is 80% proficiency. So, as a school, we've adopted that goal, and kind of specifically to zero in on 6th grade math. So our goal is 80% proficiency on the end of year state test. So for a little bit of context, so last year we had 61% proficiency. So meaning that 61% passed the test and the remaining 39 did not. So the goal is 80. We also have a goal regarding using that STAR test that we used at the adaptive test for the district. We have a goal of, that all students will make at least 1 year's worth of growth. And by being able to look at that STAR test to kind of be the indicator of whether or not that's occurring.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So I feel like we have so much context, and I think, I don't know, Ben and Grant, maybe Grant, you start off, everything, all the situation, the logistics, the practicalities. What, like give him a prescription. Let's hear it. Like what
solve my problem.
Yeah, prescribe him something.
Prescription. I'm not here to prescribe. Well, so one thing that did actually stick out to me is kind of interesting. You're describing this contrast. You were saying even if you have this discussion-oriented dynamic that's trying to inspire people about how creative math can be, if they run into a wall that requires them to find that common denominator and they can't do that, it drains you, right? It makes you go from feeling like this is a creative endeavor to it feeling like, well, this is a creative endeavor that I will never be able to engage in. And what strikes me is how that hits at all levels of math, because I was actually feeling this. Like this week, there was a little bit of math that I wanted to learn, and it's a little bit above a 6th grade level. But I found this similar dynamic where we have the fun creative side. It was this thing associated with like multiplicative number theory. And you have this fun creative side where you see these beautiful patterns and it feels like all the substance, all the things that people would be inspired about are in these beautiful patterns. But in order to extract any actual concrete problem solving from them, you just have to bash through this, like these really complicated computational ideas that, it's going to fill a bunch of your paper and you're going to have to pull back on some of these college courses for how you do a contour integral or a bunch of things. And in that way, I could identify a lot with the 6th grader who's sitting there and doesn't have a rock solid understanding of the multiplication tables. And I wonder if maybe the pendulum has swung a little bit too far away from saying math is about being able to do the computations over towards, no, math is really this creative art and we have to have a discussion oriented where, yes, that is definitely a good direction to go, but in the same way that, me trying to continue learning math and like engaging with this, I would be at a loss if I didn't grit down and go through all those like long contour integrals to get the substance out. Like those students would be at a loss if they didn't have the multiplication tables or whatever it might be that they need. So I actually, this is not a prescription. This is a long-winded way of asking you a question, Jason. Do you think that pendulum has swung too far And as measured by this, like, what is your kids' relationship with math? Is it that they come out liking it, right? If you were to ask them, do they like math? Do they like it? Or is it the classic thing where most kids still don't like math and now it's just for different reasons?
In our class, it's largely the students who like math are the ones who math comes either it's coming easily for them or that they have enough of a solid foundation that they are being successful in math. I think that, so there's definitely a positive sense. And again, I don't know if, that comes down to the culture of the room, the teaching, they think it's kind of cool that an assistant principal is like in their classroom every single day, whatever it may be. But there are definitely kids that come away enjoying their math experience, but I don't know how much of that is relative to, well, this is also going well for you and you're being successful. So how much is that is kind of self-fulfilling?
Follow-on question to that. Those students who don't seem to like it as much, if you were to interview them, say, hey, do you enjoy math? They would say, no, this is kind of a painful experience. Do you think they view math as a creative endeavor in the same way that a kid might not like writing, but they would still understand that in principle, like adults seem to describe writing like it is an artistic endeavor. Whereas certainly when I was growing up, I think most people didn't view math as a creative thing at all. It was the quintessential opposite of a creative endeavor. Do you think even the ones who are not doing great, who are viewing it as a painful experience, have gotten what sounds like might be the desired takeaway of a discussion-oriented framework, that in principle, this is supposed to be about having many different options and choosing which one is best fitted for your own needs?
I do think that even for our students who may be struggling, that they're at least coming away with experiencing an hour class that is discussion based, which is there's a lot of group interaction. It's a lot of problem solving focused. So I do think that even for the ones who are having a hard time and may not be, getting the best grade or performing, on the assessments as well as others, I do at least get the sense that they don't think it's just this rote, boring, kind of stale thing that doesn't have any sort of creative aspect to it, even if they are maybe struggling with that.
That's awesome. That's awesome to hear. Totally unrelated question, but one that I do kind of want to bring up at some point. I'm a big fanboy of Desmos, the classroom tool. All I will say is this. I generally am very skeptical of ed tech companies, especially those, I kind of am skeptical of those that market themselves as being adaptive programs. Like, we're going to take this machine learning focus and we're going to provide each student with the exact thing they need when they need it. And insofar as MATLAB is working great for your students, that's awesome. That's great. But insofar as math is supposed to be about discussion, like we're saying here, and there exists ways to amplify that with technology in a way that's not just cheesy. This is the only example I've seen that really does that very well.
Hey, I'll definitely look into it. We're always looking for, just from the looks of it even now, anything that can, again, kind of provide an access point for students at a more kind of personal or individualized level, and do so in a way that's gonna, again, make it fun or engaging, like I'm all about.
I was at this event in Kansas a couple months ago with various math teachers, and all of them were really into it. And this is part of why I wanted to ask. I was wondering how deep in the system it actually is. What strikes me about it is it tries to take these possible explorations that you can have through math and give it that right balance of feeling both guided, but not too prescriptive. Because it seems like a risk with these things that can be discussion oriented or leave these open-ended problems. And this is something I think a certain statement from Stenhaug a couple podcasts ago comes to mind, where you can end up with someone just messing around with doodles on a piece of paper, trying something and never really getting anywhere. And the upshot of things feeling open-ended is that they feel inconclusive.
Do you feel that, Fullen? Does that happen? Do you give some instruction and try to leave it open-ended, and then students are just absolutely floundering and have no idea what to do when you walk over to their table?
I think that what happens more often is that, we'll have kind of this plan for, okay, we want to introduce this topic, and then we're going to, go through these couple problems, which are pretty, multifaceted or multi-parted, and it should be a good opportunity for students to kind of engage and dive in together. And then we start on this review of, yesterday's issue or problem. And then we get into the first one or the second one. And then it's like a 30-minute kind of we just fall into this digression because everyone can't remember how to do whatever the topic was or whatever the practice was from last year, or they don't remember this particular concept, or we get sidetracked. And then again, it's just kind of this continually feeling of getting further and further behind. And, so I wouldn't necessarily say that students are floundering, but it's more of sometimes us either not anticipating kind of the degree and depth at which we need to go to help them really master the prior topic or concept before moving on kind of to the next thing, and just maybe underestimating that and not giving it as much time as it really warrants.
So I guess, first question is, how many math teachers do you have in the school?
That's a good question. So for sixth grade, we have 3 general education teachers, 1 special education teacher. And so I think that's 4. So about 12 to 14 for the entire school, because we follow that same, we've got about 3 gen ed per grade and then about 1 to 2 special ed teachers per grade.
If I sort of simplify that, you're saying like 12 to 14 math teachers. Is that a reasonable way to think about it? Or
correct? Yep.
Okay. So here's my prescription. You've got these kids, you said they're sort of coming in at different grade levels, 3rd through 9th grade. I could imagine a scenario where you kind of take 2 teachers per grade level between 3rd and 9th, and you say, we've got a 3rd grade math class in school. And whether you're 6th grade, 7th grade, or 8th grade, if you're at that 3rd grade level, we're going to put you in this math class, and we're actually going to cover the 3rd grade standards. And we're going to cover them rigorously. And one of the 3rd grade standards is know from memory multiplication tables. And so that's what we're going to do, because that's what you need. If you're in 4th grade, well, then you have these other 2 teachers that are doing that. 5th grade, we've got another 2 teachers all the way through 9th grade or whatever it is. I'm curious, what are your thoughts?
So let me kind of restate that back to you. So basically, what you're saying is kind of figure out, within reason, what our optimal range, and maybe you take up to, 90% of all the students are between 3rd and 9th grade. And we're going to kind of, divvy up and assign 1 to 2 teachers for the 3rd grade level class. And then all of my students, regardless of if they are 6th grader, 7th grader, or 8th grader, are going to have that 3rd grade math class so long as until they master the objectives or kind of the content of that class. And then could they move on to the next one within a year? Because I like that idea, and I like the kind of the expedited nature of it. And I also think too, there would be a pretty big kind of kick in the butt for you maybe a 7th or 8th grader who's in a 3rd grade math class, who kind of, if incentivized and invested in the right way, could kind of be told, well, hey, the sooner you kind of master these concepts, the sooner we start to move up and kind of help get you back to where you need to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, it has to be accelerated, because, obviously,
of course,
if you're an 8th grader and put you in a 3rd grade class, if
right,
you're
we got to catch up.
Going 1 year per year, that's not going to work. So yeah, it would have to be accelerated. It would have to be sort of, some sort of proficiency based, you kind of take tests when you're ready for them, sort of thing. But yeah, that's roughly the idea. So I'm curious what the practical problems would be implementing something like that.
And if I could even add on top of things so that we have all the more practical problems, how absurd would it be if it was genuinely self-paced, where the group of, people who are in that 3rd grade math class, because that's what they need to pass, rather than having them all move along with the same exact discussions or the same exact assignments as the teacher is prescribing it to them. If there was some notion approaching that of self-paced learning, and maybe not so much to the individual, but maybe like groups of 4 or something like that, moving along so that it is possible to graduate from that 3rd grade math class into the 4th grade one in a quarter of a year. But at the same time, you're not forced to do it in a quarter of a year. You're not forced to do it at an accelerated pace, because maybe the reason that you're there is just because you need a little bit more time with this material. How absurd would it be to try to push towards something that is a genuinely self-paced experience for the students?
That's where the ALEKS program comes in a lot, right? That is kind of our individualized kind of self-paced learning program or opportunity right now. It's just that, we're not utilizing it nearly as much as it needs to be. So, both of your ideas kind of make me think, you could go on another end of the extreme. Why aren't students just doing ALEKS for their math period? And now, and there will come up with other things of, being able to give opportunities for group work, and there's the collaboration and the discussion. But what if the teacher could serve more as, even more so of a facilitator, and take their ALEKS program, whether you're in your 3rd grade cluster, your 4th grade cluster. That is what ALEKS is. You start in 3rd grade, you master all of the standards that it says you need to master based on your knowledge check that it has periodically. And then once you have mastered all of those, you move on up to 4th grade. And then it's, each time you're just, as an administrator, you're just unlocking how many, what standards that this student can access or not.
I think this is kind of what Eder was even asking earlier, is if you just replaced those precious 56 minutes that you're allotted with a copy of MATLAB for everyone, would that work?
Well, I asked that, but I want to be careful. I'm not advocating for that, because I think there is huge downsides to just putting everyone in front of a computer for 56 minutes, and that's your math class. I think you need those group discussions. You need, the creativity. You need to do projects and other things, and the skill building is only a component of it.
And again, and this is where we kind of start to get into the challenge of the assessment and how teachers are going to be assessed of their teaching. So the teachers that I assign to the 3rd or 4th grade level groups, those are in actuality 6th, 7th, or 8th grade teachers.
Yeah, you've got to tell the state that that's a 6th grade teacher, and then they're going to be based on that 6th grade or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah. And, or somehow divvy that up, because, then, every year you have kind of the concern or the frustration of teachers who get assigned the advanced, English class versus the regular English class, and the perceptions of how, just by virtue of the differentiation of groups and the students in those groups, how their performances on the tests are almost predestined, and that's going to affect the teachers, either better score on their assessment or lower score based on how the students are going to do.
Right. So if the state changed from assessing based on the current state grade level tests to using the STAR adaptive test, would that just obviate that problem? Would that just solve it?
I think that would do a lot. To really help that. If we're using a measure that is all about growth, and we're just we're trusting that, the adaptive nature of STAR or MAP or whatever else will give a good indicator of where students are at and where they finish by the end of the year. And if the hope is, 1 year for an average teacher to 1.2 to 1.5 years for an accelerated, or whatever it is. You could create that same kind of spectrum for rubric for, the student growth performance to kind of measure your teachers.
Maybe the downside to that, or the reason that would be a difficult change to make at a policy level, is I can imagine a desire to want to say, when you graduate 6th grade, you should know 6th grade content. When you graduate 7th grade, or some kind of, I don't want to say no child left behind, but that's sort of the idea, is you don't want to leave anyone behind. You don't want to say, oh, if you graduate 8th grade and you're at a 5th grade level, that's okay, because, well, you started at a 3rd grade level and you improved. So I can see an objection there, but it really does sound like the right thing to do, though.
I don't know a lot about this, but I do know that there are models in education in schools where you may enter, let's say you enter a middle grades building, and there is no 6th, 7th, or 8th grade. It is all, it's all fluid. It is all self-paced. It is all mastery level. Why must one wait till May to move on to 7th grade content if by January I am ready to start that? Now again, there are the logistical nature of well, hey, my Math 7 course starts, in August, and it's a year-long course, so it's going to be hard just to jump in, at a specific time. But just more of the fluidity and more of the, not being so constrained by, just the kind of the standard or old way of doing things. Now, to provide my, objection to what I just said, I also know that in middle school, there's the social development aspect, which is a big piece. From 6th grade to 8th grade, a lot of things change, and there are big differences between just the maturity and the social, awareness and of a 14 or 15-year-old versus an 11 or 12-year-old.
Well, how necessarily entwined are those? If you imagine this perfectly fluid situation, does that necessarily rob from the social development happening between classes in the halls, or even during group activities that happen when you align people who are at similar positions in their self-paced trajectory?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it comes down to kind of just the difference between, kind of like the academic knowledge and where they're at academically, and then just kind of the social level or the social awareness, understanding, personal behavior, personal development, where maturation, and just those two things kind of being separate. I could see some eighth graders who are 14 or 15 years old at a very different level socially, but being on the same level academically as a sixth grader. And that same sixth grader who's at that same level academically, but is very at a different level with regards to puberty or, maturation or whatever else. And just kind of, is that the best fit? Having those two students side by side in a classroom.
Isn't this kind of what happened for a lot of history in the context of school, like some schoolhouse off in the middle of the prairie, or even just a lot of learning or time in youth spent with siblings, older and younger, where it was natural to socialize with people a couple years off from you, not just in age, but also in maturity. Like, I'm wondering, how bad is it if a group project is happening between the 15-year-old and the 11-year-old, and they just got a bit of a sibling dynamic? Like, who cares where they are with respect to puberty when it comes to how they interact on their math project and social development tied to that?
Well, there's a strong argument that having younger kids and older kids grouped together actually causes the younger kids to behave more maturely and causes the older kids to behave more maturely.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, at the end of the day, like, how big of an issue is it? Personally, I don't think it's that big. I'm kind of projecting or trying to think about what are the easiest targets that are going to kind of come out as like the opposition of doing things the way we've always done them.
For sure.
So I feel like this is preposterous. This is the craziest idea I've ever heard. The whole turning the school upside down, and now you're a third grade teacher, and hey, you were in eighth grade, and now you're going to this third grade classroom. It's just,
you're not a third grade teacher.
You're teaching third grade math.
A middle school teacher who's teaching the Common Core standards for third graders, which is appropriate for the students in your class.
100% agree. And I 100% agree that this is the ideal world in which we would live, in which students are self-paced and being taught and assessed the exact content that's appropriate for their skill level.
But you're pointing out a valid concern, which is like there's some stigmatism potentially involved here.
I'm not even worried about this. I think it might be like irresponsible for us to suggest this to Jason. Like, okay, not this school year, but like literally imagine with the stakeholders, the parents that are going to call, the other teachers, the high school teachers that are going to inherit these students, and now they're in this wacky system, the people from the state accountability that are going to come and say, what the heck's going on here? I think there's a law that you need to be teaching the sixth grade standards in a sixth grade classroom. Like, if Jason actually goes into the summer and plans this out and reorganizes the school around this, that just seems crazy dangerous. I'm not sure the expected value is lower than current practice in the status quo, but the variance sure as heck is way higher.
Actually, this is worth kind of drilling in on what would happen, right? Like, you're painting this picture of stakeholders coming and being angry and throwing pitchforks at Jason for sixth grade teachers not teaching sixth graders or whatever it might be. But actually, like, so suppose Jason went in tomorrow and he's like, you know what? The impact I want to have on this school, I want it to be held up. People from across the nation are going to look at it as that one school that tried that one crazy thing of totally making things more fluid. Because there was a little bit of momentum in that direction with with their math lab and Alex program and such going on, and it was just taking that to its extreme. And he pushes for that, and he convinces people and has the influence to restructure things. What's the first wall that's actually hit, right? Who's the first person you piss off doing that?
The teachers.
The teachers wouldn't. I mean,
because of the assessment.
I honestly, I think the teachers, just by virtue of, I don't mean to paint this in a negative kind of characteristic. I just think that the teachers are going to be very oppositional to any kind of major change of kind of just how things are going. And now, hopefully, if I have done a really good job of investing them and helping them understand the value and how to actually kind of make their lives easier or be able to be more targeted or more focused, then I could see that being okay. But if I went in there tomorrow and just brought this up immediately, I just think that, I mean, if Alex is taking all the time in the classroom, I could see a teacher saying, well, so what am I supposed to do?
If it were the case that the state came and first said, okay, we're not going to use these exit exams anymore. We are going to use an adaptive test, and we're going to evaluate schools or whatever it is that they do with the data that they currently have from these grade level tests. We're going to look at growth, and that's what we're going to care about. If the state came down and said that, and it was clear to teachers that, like, you're going to be evaluated based on the growth of your students, and that's it. They're not going to be expected. It sounds a little bit crazy to say it this way, but they're not going to be expected. An eighth grade student is not going to be expected to have mastered the eighth grade concepts. An eighth grade student is expected to grow at least one grade level, preferably more. If the state made that change, would it still be a hard sell to the teachers?
Yeah, I think that would definitely be a big hurdle that would be taken down. I mean, teachers knowing that at the end of the day, as far as it affects me or evaluates my performance as a teacher, if it is purely, okay, where they start and where they end, okay, great. But then still, am I teaching eighth graders or am I teaching seventh graders? And if I've got in my eighth grade classroom, if I've got kids at fourth, fifth, sixth, and all the way up, now the challenge still is, how do I get each of those kids to move a year ahead when they may each be at different spots? Now, obviously, the Alex or some other variation of forming the groups may help with that. So I could see them being more amenable to that with that state policy change on the assessment.
I will say I was actually surprised by three things hearing more boots to the ground. One, how the focus really is on the teacher being a facilitator to some extent already. Two, how there exists this notion of MATLAB and Alex. And then three, even if the way that the state's measuring things isn't perfect, the fact that it is ostensibly based on growth rather than like kind of absolute metrics at the end. All three of those, I wouldn't have guessed is sort of the state of your modal school. And give me a sense of optimism about how the utopian future of self-paced public schools being the standard. What I once thought to be this starry-eyed, like, if that ever happens, it'll only be ever because there was some crazy restructuring of the entire system. I almost feel a little bit more optimistic about that happening within the next couple decades. I don't know if I'm crazy optimistic about, within the next couple of years, or it seems like there would be all sorts of trouble for someone like Jason to go through to actually make it happen. But I'm actually shocked at how much more plausible it seemed. I would have been very bearish about that as even being conceivable at the start, before we even started recording, compared to where I am now.
I'm actually not convinced that it's at all practical. I mean, based on this conversation.
Oh yeah?
I mean, I think it's easy for us to talk about, but from what I'm hearing, there's some pretty big hurdles.
I mean, yeah, okay, to be clear, I also agree that I think it would be incredibly hard to the point where it is not in one man's hands. It is not in Jason's hands. And it would be a confluence of multiple factors, like a shift in culture and a shift in what is prescribed from the state down. But it does feel like there's little micro developments in the correct direction.
That's fair. Yeah.
Also say, and Jason, I'm curious your perspective on this. The fact that we're having this conversation, that you're asking these questions, that you're even considering this but I think good idea, idealistically, I think is one of the exact objectives of this Bright Ohio program, is to get people like you, good leaders, curious minds, want to make things happen, want to serve students well, want to see everyone on grade 11 succeeding to and through college, to get you in schools and thinking about these sorts of things.
Most definitely. I mean, there's no question that education, for a long time has been somewhat of a stagnant field. I forget the exact, kind of example, but always talking about how, if you look back 200 years ago, our classrooms look pretty similar to how they did then, whereas all these other aspects of society have, drastically progressed. And I think as a result of that, there can oftentimes be just a a very firm grasp on the status quo and on how things are, and not kind of trying to cast vision and think into the future of the fact that in 10 to 15 to 20 years, school should look very different than what it does right now. How it's going to look different, I don't know. And I think, yes, that like the point of this Bright Ohio program is to, one, attract people who are committed to helping to kind of see this out and help to visualize that future. And then two, targeting people who may not be your traditional, prototypical, education, college, to teacher in the classroom, to, district level curriculum specialist, all the way up to principal, just for sheer fact of having just a different perspective. And not that there is anything wrong with the traditional pathway of educators, but more so just the aspect that, as the business community saw prior to creating this program, education needs more outside influence in order to be more dynamic, more innovative, and just to think a little bit more outside the box, because that is the future that we're preparing our students for. And we need to help to model some of those same competencies and skills while we are in the classroom with them, so that they can have those when they graduate or leave our buildings and go out into the future.
How strict is this like 56-minute limit? Is there any possibility that a highly encouraged after school activity is something like, an extra half hour on Khan Academy, or a place where people can be? Or is it just, this is a hard limit? These kids got a lot going on in their lives. Like the last thing that we can possibly introduce is yet another academic requirement.
We actually just this year, through the kind of efforts of another one of our school administrators and my same co-teacher that I teach with, they started an after-school math tutoring program. So right now it's just one day a week, but it is an after-school, hour. We have a couple local community college students come, so provide one-on-one tutoring to kind of provide help for 6th, 7th, 8th grader, homework, tests, whatever it is. But as we've talked about this, there's definitely the vision that, we should have kids coming and they could just be doing Alex. And it could be everybody. It doesn't need to be a kid, even if you feel like you're behind. We could pack out the entire cafeteria if we could just get people to get picked up, or begin to think about other creative ways of transportation if we have a critical mass. But so that has come up and has started, but it's still at its kind of infant stages of really right now just helping kind of that really small 1% to 2% of students who feel like they need enough help that they're going to stay after school on, for an hour for tutoring.
Oh, I actually have some advice then on this one. I don't think we should be calling this tutoring. Okay. I think the word tutoring carries a lot of stigma associated with it's like because you're behind and need to get ahead. I think society in general needs another word for this. Like there's one kid who I quote unquote tutor, but it's not because he's behind. It's actually quite the opposite. It's more just like a better word would be mentoring, I guess. But
or like I think of like working out. Like I go to the gym to work out, and and I understand. there's some stigma for just working out. Whether you feel like you're fit or in shape or out of shape or whatever, but you see a wide range of places where people are at, and they still are coming to this one place, with a general similar goal. So, but I agree. I think the word tutoring implies a lot of things that we don't want it to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't have a great name off the top of my head. Just so long as it doesn't end up being something, cheesy, just like the math hour or something like that. Working out is a rock solid analogy there, right? Because you have the people who are in there religiously, and you also have the people in there January 1st hoping to, bring about a new habit that they don't already have. I think just shifting that such that the vibe in students' mind is like, oh, this is a thing I should go to, regardless of my level. This is what will help me get ahead in life or enter high school with more competence and confidence and likelihood to succeed, or whatever it might be. And also the more that hour itself is less about the community college members you have coming over to tutor being explainers to the students that they're there to offer their own expertise, but if it is as similar as possible a vibe to what you describe in the classrooms as being facilitators, or even the more extreme one that we had of if everyone really is doing, whether it's ALEKS or whether it's like Khan Academy or something to that effect, if their role is one of floating around among students who are working either on their own or maybe in small groups in that closer to the utopian self-paced way. And, because I think the thing about a lot of these self-paced systems, you do hit walls, and then it's really frustrating if you as the student are kind of at that wall and you're like, well, great. Like, I know it's supposed to be self-paced, but my pace right now is 0. And that's demotivating because I don't know what to do next. If the role of all of the students, it's awesome that you kind of have them coming over to be these tutors, is to seek out, to go on all fours and sniff around for every time that there is someone who is hitting that wall in their own self-paced system. And if they're trained, that is the goal, that it is not that they're supposed to sit next to someone and spend an hour explaining some specific math topic to them, but that their specific function is to seek out students doing a self-paced program, hitting a wall. That feels like it would all be in the right direction and pretty plausible.
And that's one thing I've noticed with any kind of ed tech, which is in watching students use Khan Academy, but I'm sure ALEKS is the same way, the difference between a teacher that jumps in immediately when a student is struggling versus a teacher that sits back and maybe gives them a slight nudge in the right direction. Like, it's maybe 10 times more effective when the teacher doesn't jump in right away, but it goes against the teacher's intuition every single time. So I think there's also room for instruction on how to tutor alongside ALEKS. And it sounds like, I'm assuming these things aren't happening at your school, and I don't think they're happening generally with teachers and folks using ed tech as far as training goes, as far as best practices.
Honestly, I just think anything that enables a period of time where the student can be doing something based on where they are and doesn't have to feel the pressure of their peers moving at a certain rate, whether that's slower than they want or faster than they want. I just think that it would be really hard to have a system that messes that up, just because that's such a step above having all of your time spent in a batched process.
I'm trying to think of an analogy now too. A bad vacuum's better than no vacuum at all.
Jason, it's been a real pleasure actually getting to chat with you on this. You have a delightful confluence of backgrounds to inform us in ways that we absolutely otherwise wouldn't be. So I really appreciate you taking the time.
Hey, and I appreciate all you guys' feedback. And I will say, I mean, for the time spent here, I mean, this has been well worth it and has given me a lot to think about. And it again, in education, I feel like we just don't take enough time to really step back and be able to talk to other people and talk to just what we're doing. And again, having someone just from the outside hear kind of our problem and offer just a perspective, even if it is completely removed, sometimes I feel like that's more impactful than the people who are around it all day to day, just because we can get so mired in just the minutia of what's going on that we need that outside perspective to really help us kind of figure out what that solution is going to be.
Grant here again to close things off. I definitely came away from that much more optimistic about the education system in America than I thought I would be. I mean, I'll be the first to say there's room for improvement, but it's definitely the case that there have been steps in the right direction since how I remember things being done way back when. I mentioned a little of this in the upcoming episode since we've already recorded it and I'm kind of out of sync doing intro-outro stuff here. I really do think that you could have a whole podcast just devoted to teacher chats a little bit like this one. I think my actual suggestion was to just have Stenhaug do that because I have a tendency to recoil back from the thought of more time-consuming projects. But if that's the kind of thing that some of you would like to hear or that you think others would like to hear, just casual conversations with people in the classroom, what do they see? What changes are they experiencing? What do they want to see? Let us know. Write back to us. We do read all of the comments that people make on the various social media pages.